Hello, and welcome to tonight's program. I'm Tara Laver, Senior Archivist for the museum, and I've had the great fun and privilege to be a co-curator on the exhibition Origins, Collecting to Create the Nelson-Atkins, which connects to this presentation tonight. I hope you've had a chance to visit the exhibition, but if you haven't, we hope tonight's presentation will pique your interest and you'll come visit soon. On view through March 6th, Origins, Collecting to Create the Nelson-Atkins, explores the beginnings of the museum's collection by considering the very earliest acquisitions, placing them within the historical context of the Great Depression, and exploring the people who shaped the museum's initial early purchases, and shaped it through their personalities, expertise, and choices. Tonight, we'll have a chance to delve further into those stories, and you'll see that there's quite a cast of characters. First, a few housekeeping things. Closed captions are enabled, so if you'd like to take advantage of that accessibility feature, that's there for you. We will answer questions after all of the speakers have gone, so you can save your questions to the end or feel free to drop them in the Q&A as we go along. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to William Rudolph, who is Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Nelson-Atkins. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Good evening, everyone. I am very pleased to help welcome you to this event that is the first of our public programs celebrating Origins, Collecting to Create the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. It's been very fun, I think, for all of us on the staff to watch the curatorial team uncover and remind us of these stories and these objects, some of which you know very well, and some of which you probably don't know well, but will know a lot better over the course of the run. Before I introduce my colleagues who will be sharing origin stories with us, I would like to thank some entities for their support in making this exhibition possible. The Marianne and Henry Block Family Foundation, Paul DeBruce and Linda Woodsmall DeBruce, the Richard J. Stern Foundation for the Arts, Commerce Bank trustee, Teresa Meager and T. Bradley Manson, and Hush Blackwell LLP, and all of you, because your support of the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art through your memberships, through your visitation, through your positive word of mouth, and through your attendance at programs like this, virtually now and in person soon, we hope, really helps us do what we need to do and what we love to do. Now, what I'd love to do is to introduce my colleagues. I am joined tonight, as you can see, by MacKenzie Mallon, Provenance Specialist, who is one of the co-curators of the project, along with Dr. Kimberly Masteller, the Jean McCrae Beals Curator of South and Southeast Asian Art, one of the other co-curators, but also important roles have been played and will be brought alive for you this evening by Dr. Ling-en Lu, our Curator of Chinese Art, and Dr. Stephanie Fox-Knappe, our Samuel Sosland Curator, or Samuel Sosland Senior Curator of American Art. So with that, would you please join me in listening and learning, and I'd like to turn it over to MacKenzie Mallon. MacKenzie?
Thank you, William, and thank you, Tara. And many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. I'll begin with an overview of how the Nelson-Atkins collected art in its earliest years, hopefully providing context for the in-depth stories that you'll hear throughout this evening. And then after the overview, I'll start some deep dives with a brief discussion of how one particular object entered the Nelson-Atkins collection. And then I'll yield the floor to my fantastic colleagues who will continue delving further into some of the most fascinating objects in the early collection and the stories behind them. Incidentally, all of the works of art included in my presentation are currently on view in the Origins exhibition, so I hope that you'll visit and see them for yourselves. The Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art is rooted in the legacy of two Kansas Cityans, William Rockhill Nelson and Mary Atkins. Nelson, publisher of the Kansas City Star newspaper, and Atkins, a retired school teacher and real estate investor, both left money in their wills to establish an art museum in Kansas City. Although they were unaware of each other's bequest, the two legacies were perfectly complementary. Atkins was to fund a museum building, and Nelson's was to acquire art. In the late 1920s, the trustees of Nelson's estate, businessmen Herbert V. Jones, Arthur M. Hyde, and Staci Nichols, began to consider the task that laid ahead of them: how to assemble an art collection using the funds Nelson left for that purpose. Within the booming economy of the Roaring '20s, entering the art market was a challenging endeavor. Prices were generally high, and supply of available artworks was relatively low. But despite the economic obstacles, the trustees wanted to build a collection of art from many different cultures and time periods. So from the very beginning, they needed to be creative and utilize a variety of methods and strategies for acquiring art. Their first venture was in 1928, when they entered into a partnership with the Louvre Museum in Paris to co-sponsor an archaeological excavation in Tello, Iraq. The document solidifying that partnership is shown here on the right. This sort of arrangement was referred to as partage, and it involved splitting the costs and subsequently the excavated objects of an archaeological dig between multiple benefactors, usually museums, universities, and source countries. This allowed museums to acquire works of ancient art, which were not widely available on the market at the time. The brick seen here on the left was the very first object acquired by the Nelson-Atkins, and it was found during this excavation in Iraq. The museum co-sponsored several archaeological digs during its earliest years in conjunction with other museums and universities. But by 1930, the economic landscape had changed dramatically. The stock market crash of October 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression led to declining prices for luxury goods like art. The market was flooded with art objects that would have been next to impossible to find just months previously. And as art dealers and private collectors began selling their collections at a rapid pace in order to raise cash, prices came down and art became more affordable on the traditional market. The Nelson trustees recognized this change, and in 1930, they made their first purchase from an art dealer, a group of 9 portraits from Kansas City-based dealer Yunt Art Galleries. This acquisition from a local dealer emphasized the trustees' commitment to involving the local Kansas City community in the new museum's development. But the first trustees of Nelson's estate were primarily businessmen, and they had little knowledge of art. They knew they were going to need help determining what kinds of art to collect for the new museum going forward and how to go about acquiring it. So they hired agents who advised them on these matters and worked as their purchasing representatives. 3 of these agents were the most influential on the development of the Nelson-Atkins collection in the earliest years: Harold Woodbury Parsons, Langdon Warner, and Lawrence Sickman. Parsons served as the agent for antiquities and European and American art. Although he had little formal art training himself, he had a keen artistic eye and an expansive network of contacts in the art market, which he had built up over the previous 20 years because he was working as an agent for other museums and private collectors. He was independently wealthy and spent about 6 months of each year seeking out art treasures in Europe, often aboard his yacht, which he called Saharet. His efforts were noticed by the Kansas City Press, as this cartoon from a January 1931 issue of the Kansas City Star attests. It reads, "Harold Woodbury Parsons, purchaser for the Nelson Gallery of Art, returns after 6 months in Europe and intimates many surprises in store." We'll return to Parsons in just a few moments. Langdon Warner was instrumental in the early development of the museum's Asian art collection. He was an archaeologist, professor, and curator at Harvard, and is considered by some as having been the inspiration for Indiana Jones, which I think is kind of obvious given this photograph. He purchased works of Asian art for the Nelson-Atkins in China, Japan, and the US between 1930 and 1935, including a group of more than 300 Japanese prints, such as the one seen here on the right. Upon departing China, following a purchasing trip in the summer of 1931, Warner left the money he had left over from the Nelson-Atkins with his protege, Lawrence Sickman. Now, Sickman was studying in China at the time, and Warner tasked him with continuing the hunt for Asian art for the museum. And so for the next 4 years, Sickman would acquire key objects, including the Eastern Han Dynasty dog that's seen here on the right. Ling-en will tell us more about Sickman later in the program. From 1930 to 1933, the Nelson-Atkins collection grew at a frantic pace. By the time the museum opened in December of 1933, it included an impressive group of objects from many cultures and time periods, the excellence of which contributed to the museum's developing international reputation. And as the financial effects of the Depression waned and purchasing opportunities and bargains presented themselves at a slower pace, the Nelson-Atkins trustees and their agents turned their focus to enriching the collection. During this period, they partnered with a handful of dealers in order to acquire some truly exceptional standout pieces for the collection. These dealers were often scholars themselves and worked in tandem with the museum's agents. For example, the Nelson-Atkins purchased works of ancient art, such as the Egyptian portrait seen here on the left, from Parisian dealers Paul and Marguerite Mallon. In the Origins exhibition, you can view a home video made by Paul Mallon during a trip he and Marguerite made to Kansas City in 1937. Ling-en and Kim will tell us about two other dealers who were instrumental in developing the collection during this period, C.T. Liu and Arthur Upham Pope, a little bit later in the program. The Kansas City community was involved in the development of the Nelson-Atkins collection from the very beginning, both through the museum's purchases from local vendors and gifts from private collectors. In addition to the first locally made purchase of 9 portraits from Yunt art galleries, as I discussed previously, the Nelson-Atkins also bought hundreds of Native American objects, including this gorgeous serape from Kansas City-based Fred Harvey Company. They were known for their chain of restaurants, dining cars, and hotels that were associated with the adjacent Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad. And the Fred Harvey Company's large collection of Native American art outgrew the company's museum in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So they began selling pieces to other museums, including the Nelson-Atkins. Private Kansas City collectors contributed too, through gifts of art, money, and personal involvement with the museum. Local collectors, such as Ella Anna Clark, whose portrait is seen here on the left, and Frances Logan, who's seen here in the middle, donated pieces from their own collections. And when it became known that a restriction in William Rockwell Nelson's will prevented the purchase of contemporary art for the new museum, a group of Kansas Cityans rallied together to provide a solution, as Stephanie will tell us about later in the program. And so the earliest years of collecting at the Nelson-Atkins resulted in a core collection of exceptional pieces from a variety of cultures and time periods. The Nelson trustees and their agents successfully navigated the complexities of an art market that had been transformed by the Great Depression, and their unique expertise and personalities helped build this impressive collection in a really short period of time. But this overview of the museum's early history is just the beginning. Each object collected during this period, and indeed throughout the museum's history all the way down to today, has a unique and fascinating story to tell. So now let's shift our focus to exploring some of them in a little bit more depth. First, I want to return to Harold Woodbury Parsons. As you recall, he was a purchasing agent and advisor for antiquities and European and American art. Parsons was recommended to the Nelson trustees by the director of the Cleveland Museum of Art, Frederick Allen Whiting. Parsons had served as an agent for Cleveland since 1915 and would continue working for both museums simultaneously until 1941. The Cleveland staff had advised the Nelson trustees on a number of other issues as well, from the architecture and the gallery layout of the new museum's building to the kinds of art that they should collect. And in January of 1931, Parsons accompanied the Nelson trustees on a visit to Cleveland to meet with the staff there and to view a new exhibition of objects being offered for sale at the Cleveland Museum by a group of dealers. The exhibition displayed an exceptional collection of medieval and early Renaissance ecclesiastical objects, which is commonly known as the Guelph treasure. Owned by the Dukes of Braunschweig-Lüneburg, for centuries it had been moved around Europe as familial control of the treasure passed from one heir to the next within various branches of European ruling families. The treasure was purchased from the Braunschweig heirs in October 1929 by a group of dealers who packed it up and shipped it to the US for a multi-year exhibition tour in an effort to find buyers for the individual objects in the collection. The treasures exhibition was something of a spectacle. It was highly touted in the press. It opened to great acclaim and large crowds, as you can see here at Cleveland on the right. The Cleveland Museum of Art purchased 9 objects from the exhibition, and these continue to form a key part of their collection today. Parsons wanted the Nelson-Atkins to acquire pieces from the treasure as well, but he was unsure that the Nelson trustees would approve because the prices were high. But knowing the esteem that the Nelson trustees had for Cleveland's staff after all the advising that they had done for them, Parsons wrote to the new director of the Cleveland Museum, William Milliken, a week before traveling to Cleveland with the Nelson trustees. He wrote, "I am going to ask you to do everything you can to help me at this time. I want the trustees to realize that a museum such as ours in Cleveland is what the people of Kansas City really want. I feel confident that after the trustees have seen our museum in Cleveland, they will be persuaded that the best policy is to spend large sums of money on outstanding works of art." This quote is indicative of how Parsons and the Nelson trustees sometimes clashed over how best to go about acquiring art for the Nelson-Atkins. Over the previous 9 months since Parsons' hire, they had often been at odds regarding the collecting strategy. Parsons advocated for spending top dollar and not risking losing a buying opportunity as a result of the delays that were inherent with negotiation. The trustees, on the other hand, although they were eager to acquire outstanding works for the Nelson-Atkins collection, argued that they should be able to apply the same negotiating strategies they used in their business experience to purchasing works of art. After viewing the treasure exhibition in Cleveland, Parsons recommended the trustees purchase 2 objects, a 14th century relic cross and a 15th century monstrance. The cross is currently on view in the Origins exhibition, and the monstrance can be found in Gallery P6. As Parsons suspected, the trustees thought the cross's $3,750 price was too high. They urged Parsons to negotiate, and ultimately the dealers did reduce their price from $3,750 down to $2,500, 2/3 the original cost. The purchase of the relic cross is an example of a narrative that played out many times during the museum's early years. Parsons would suggest paying a dealer's first asking price with no questions asked, and the trustees would refuse, opting to negotiate instead. Sometimes Parsons was right, and the delay that resulted as offers and counteroffers were traded back and forth via telegram or letter would ultimately lead to the Nelson-Atkins missing out on buying opportunities. But more often than not, the trustees were able to maximize the impact of William Rockhill Nelson's bequest by negotiating the best possible price for the best possible objects. Both Parsons and the trustees had the new museum's interests at heart, and despite their differing views on how best to make art purchases, they gradually learned to have confidence in each other's instincts. The trustees accepted Parsons' advice on the kinds of art to acquire and where to acquire it, and Parsons learned to listen to the trustees' advice on when to drive a harder bargain. Their ability to compromise, collaborate, and play off each other's strengths would contribute to their continued success in developing the Nelson-Atkins collection until Parsons' retirement in 1953. Today, the relic cross is seldom exhibited at the Nelson-Atkins due to its extremely fragile condition. So I hope that you have the chance to come see it on display in the Origins exhibition on view through March 6th. Now I'll turn things over to Dr. Kim Masteller.
Good evening. If you have seen the Origins exhibition already, then you're familiar with the stunning, monumental mosaic spandrels, those triangular decorative panels of an arch that frame an entire wall of the exhibition. Created in Iran, this is an example of Persian art, This grand mosaic had a long journey in order to reach Kansas City, and part of it almost didn't make it. Tonight, I will share its origin story. Next slide. Every good story begins with a great cast of characters. And in the case of the Persian mosaic, the cast includes some people you know: Paul Gardner, the founding director of the Nelson Gallery of Art, and its early trustees. To advise them in what art to collect, the museum engaged consultants. For Asian art, you've already met Langdon Warner, the famous Harvard archaeologist, professor, and curator of Asian art here in the center. And to advise on Islamic and Persian art, Langdon Warner recommended that the museum hire Arthur Upham Pope, seen here standing next to him, taking photographs from the roof of the Great Mosque of Isfahan. As you will hear, it was not unusual for Warner to find himself stuck in the middle between Pope and the museum. The last figure I want to introduce you to is the dealer, the figure on the far right, who was the seller of the mosaic spandrels. His name was Ayub Rabineau. Rabineau belonged to a family of Persian art dealers, and he owned galleries in Tehran and Paris. Rabineau sold works to many museums, and frequently through Pope's recommendation. The relationship between Pope and Rabineau went back a long way. Pope said that the Rabineau family essentially took him in when he first came to Iran. Pope hired Rabineau to work on archaeological excavations with him and called him the best digger in Iran. They were tight. Next slide. On March 20th of 1932, the trustees met with Arthur Upham Pope in New York. Pope was an early champion of Persian art and culture. He founded the American Institute for Persian Art and Archaeology. He spent his life editing the massive multi-volume survey of Persian art. You see detail on the left with his wife, Phyllis Ackerman. He organized international exhibitions. And to help fund all of this, he also consulted on art sales. Pope worked to convince the trustees that their mission for great art meant Persian art. And the very next day, Pope sent the trustees an 8-page letter, quote, quite a long report, according to Staci Nichols, with detailed descriptions of works of art he was recommending that the museum purchase, about $34,000 worth. At the top of his recommendations, Pope began with architecture. Next slide. In particular, Pope talks about the art historical importance of Persian tiles, particularly Persian mosaic faience. That's mosaics created out of glazed tiles. The kind of decoration that you see here, especially on the right, as you look up at the arched entranceway of the Shah Mosque in Isfahan, Iran. Pope goes on to explain, quote, every glaze has a critical firing point at which it yields the purest and most lustrous surface. By firing each one separately, the most brilliant possible gamut of tones can be secured. I mean, look at it. He's absolutely right. Next slide. Pope then pitches this pair of mosaic spandrels. The price is $5,000. They're impressive. They're about 14 feet high by 20 feet across. And you can see them here well in the photographs that he sent to illustrate them. The trustees were looking for something just like this. However, on the same trip to New York, they also visited another dealer of Persian art, Hagop Kevorkian. And they decided to purchase a large arch from him instead of Pope. The trustees had Warner negotiate the deal. When Pope learned of this, he was really ticked off. He wrote an angry letter to Warner, quote, this failure of my hopes to render any valuable service to Kansas City is a very real blow to me. It comes frankly as a practical calamity at a time when I am financing the survey, a great deal of my own institute work, all of my own research. The amount I would have had from the sale of the mosaic faience is a very serious item just now. I am bounding along on borrowed money, end quote. But that was 1932. It's now 1933, and things have already changed. The Nelson trustees and staff are creating a Persian period room in the Asian galleries on the second floor. And for some reason, the museum decided to return the arch they bought from Kevorkian. They shared their urgent need for a new major work of art, and Pope directed them back to these spandrels. In May 1933, the trustees offered Pope half the original asking price, $2,500, and Pope accepted. The trustees gave $1,500 as a down payment, the remainder to be paid after its delivery in Kansas City. And at this point, the arch was in Paris with the dealer Robineau. Pope was leaving for Oxford, England, and the Nelson trustees and Gardner were soon heading off to the East Coast for their summer vacations. And this is when the problems began. Next slide. Robineau had the 10 sections of the spandrels packed into crates in France and shipped them to the United States. They arrived in Kansas City in July and then sat unopened at the museum until August. When Gardner returned and examined the contents, he then saw that the section of the top right point of the arch, which here on the right is illustrated in yellow, that section was missing. And in fact, it had been replaced with a mismatched section of a completely different mosaic. The efforts to resolve this mistake unfolded over a series of frantic telegrams and letters over the next several months. Next slide. Pope confirmed the shipping error with Robineau, as you see here. In this next set of telegrams, you'll see the rush to get the correct mosaic on a boat and get it to Kansas City in time to be installed before the December opening of the museum. I want to point out on the telegram on the right, dated August 25th, Pope says, "It's been shipped per your instructions. The balance is due. I have commitments. I want to be paid." Next slide. And then in this exchange, Pope is not getting a response on the left. On the right, this brief response from the museum says essentially, when the correct point arrives, here we'll cable the balance. No point, no payment. This debacle certainly hurt the relationship between Pope and the museum. And in a long letter to Gardner, dated September 13th of 1933, Pope outlines his complaints. Quote, "You have a real grievance with Robineau, and on the other hand, has Kansas City been wholly fair with him? I was authorized to make this price, much to Robineau's regrets, because he was really facing bankruptcy. I gave Robineau what he needed. This, however, left me absolutely without funds, with my wife ill. I had obligations I could not meet. My bank account was overdrawn. Was it fair to penalize me? After all, I was not the vendor. I was the acting agent for Kansas City." Next slide. On September 21st, Gardner writes that the correct mosaic panel has arrived in Kansas City. On September 23rd, Gardner instructs Miss Brelford, the secretary to the trustees of the William Rockhill Nelson Trust, to pay the balance owed to Pope, including the difference in the exchange value, as the US dollar had dropped against the British pound since the time of the purchase agreement in May. I also love how they'll pay him the extra money, but they want the $60 that it took to clear that new mosaic panel in customs, and $3.81 in freight. Next slide. The museum staff then focused their efforts on installing the spandrels. In a letter to the trustees, Gardner outlined his plan. Quote, I find after putting the spandrel together that it is too wide to go in the little alcove where we had the other one set up. It would, however, go on the west wall of the Persian room, and it would make a fitting effect for the entrance into the fine Hindu room. And it would also leave an ideal place for the display of the great Polish rug. A wonderful carpet, which you'll be able to see starting next weekend in the Weaving Splendor exhibition. Next slide. So with that shipping debacle now long resolved, I invite you all to come and visit this much traveled mosaic. Spend some time looking at the carefully produced and cut and assembled tiles. You will marvel at the great effort it took to create it, and now understand a bit about the great effort it took to bring it here to Kansas City. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn over the program to Dr. Ling-en Lu.
Many of you may know very well about the former curator and director, Sickman, and his acquisition for the famous Chinese art collection at the Nelson-Atkins. I would like to share with you one of my favorite stories about him. The story tells his endeavor in his role as a curator and as a scholar. This pair of Bodhisattva is featured in the exhibition of Origins. Manjushri and Samantabhadra are Buddhist Bodhisattva of wisdom and virtue. They often appear as a pair, flanking a statue of Buddha in painting and sculpture. This deity can be identified from their animal seeds: lion for Manjushri on the left, and elephant for Samantabhadra on the right. These sculptures are not very big. The colors and the material suggest they come from a temple. They may have been part of a larger group of temple sculptures used as cultic icons. In a letter to the trustee chair, Staci Nichols, on November 1934, Sickman gave an account of how he acquired the sculptures. He stated that he spotted the pair in a Beijing dealer shop, but did not make up his mind. He needed to make a field research trip before he could decide. The trip was so important that he needed to verify the provenance of this pair of sculptures and a much larger mural painting that was already in the museum. 2 years ago, in 1932, the museum acquired this gigantic mural, assembly of Tejaprabha, from the art dealer C.T. Lu, features on the right. This is an important artwork, not only because it's artistic tradition, but also because it's no historical context in the 14th century. C.T. Lu had so many mural paintings to Western museums. Most of the mural paintings were cut into small fragments. This painting, Assembly of Tejaprabha, is one of the very few surviving examples that retain relatively intact composition. Such a larger painting need a large wall to install. At that time, the museum was looking for an architectural components to build a Chinese period room. The model temple room on the left is also on display in the Origins exhibition. C.T. Lu brought this model to the museum to show how the huge mural can be installed and how it can structure a Chinese art gallery as a period room. Everything of this model is handmade. C.T. Lu's idea as shown in the model eventually lay out the gallery on the right to what we know as Chinese Temple Room today. Chinese Temple Room received much attention during and after the grand opening in 1933, and the large mural was installed on the south wall inside the lattice gate panel. Such an important mural painting would deserve full attention from any curator. However, C.T. Lu told the museum only a little bit about where this painting comes from. Gathering all the information, the museum member knew it may have come from a temple called the Guangsheng Monastery, located in the southwest Shanxi province. This is a region full of rich Buddhist art and architecture. Lawrence Sickman then planned a trip to visit the temple and also conduct his field research. He embarked on the trip on October 1934. The trip turned out to be challenging. Heavy rain day after night derailed the traffic. In a letter he wrote to museum director Paul Gardner, he said, "I have stayed into several mud holes and went into well about my knees." Because of bad weather, he stayed there for 2 extra weeks. Despite the hurdle, he was able to visit the temple and took many photographs. He wrote to Nichols, "I not only learned definitely that our painting does come from that temple, but also obtain a great deal of information." Sickman appreciated the history and the importance of Chinese temple. "I think we are most fortunate to possess such a splendid example," he wrote. He took his 2 extra weeks to study the rich legacy of temple art in and around the region. His travel account and research notes still remain in the museum. They are quite accurate, even seen today. He claimed himself one of the pioneer scholars for the outstanding temple art in China. In his publications, he offered a theory that there was a high level of temple art, and this tradition was maintained by the family workshop during the Yuan dynasty from 13th century to 14th century. Their work of art feature distinctive style, such as our large murals. When I wrote my dissertation about Chinese temple mural, his publication became my important resources. His proposal of regional artistic tradition certainly inspired my research. So back to Beijing after the field trip, Lawrence Sickman wanted to acquire this pair of sculptures. However, the sculptures were sold to a Japanese dealer called Yamanaka. Sickman took several days to trace them down so he can purchase them. Only this time, the price was getting higher. Nevertheless, he still purchased them, as he assured that both mural and sculptures embedded in the same regional artistic tradition and the same time frame. Next, please. The clay sculpture was displayed in the temple room, as shown in the photograph on the left. I assume this pair manuscript was at the other end. We also see many Buddhist sculptures displayed in this room. In the 1930s, museum members such as Nichols have different thoughts about how this gallery can be used. And that reflects how American museum professionals saw Chinese art at that time. I believe Sickman was the one who defined this gallery to the surrounding that we know as Chinese temple room today. He installed several Buddhist sculptures in the space, so to realize his idea of Chinese temple according to what he saw in China. In an interview published in 1938, the KC journalist particularly noted that Sickman has visited a temple where the mural was originally from. Because of his research for the object context, the Nelson displays boasted one of the finest in the country. Thank you so much. I turn the stage to Senior Curator Stephanie.
Hello. Next slide, please. So when the William Rockwell Nelson Gallery of Art and Mary Atkins Museum of Fine Art opened its doors on October 11th, 1933, it was filled with treasures, as you've heard tonight, and also as this New York Times article points out. However, what guests to the new museum in Kansas City did not see in the galleries was art by living artists or art by anyone who had breathed their last within the last 3 decades. The cold shoulder to the new and the recent and the now was actually the result of a restrictive clause in William Rockwell Nelson's will. Next slide, please. This clause stated that proceeds from Nelson's estate could not be used to purchase art if the artist had died fewer than 30 years before. Next slide. If we stop to think about this for a moment, neither Claude Monet, whom you see on the left, nor John Singer Sargent had been dead for a full decade when the museum opened in 1933. Matisse, Picasso, and other great moderns were still very much alive and at the heart of their careers. This stipulation then, in addition to events like the founding of the Museum of Modern Art in New York just a few years prior, galvanized conversations regarding the place of contemporary art in this new museum. It also spurred the founding of the Friends of Art, a group that offered a clever workaround to Nelson's restrictive mandate that was officially incorporated in December 1934 on the museum's first anniversary. Next slide. That contemporary art indeed had a place at this museum was something that Director Paul Gardner and the trustees recognized as not just desirable, but also necessary. It was vital not only to ensure the significance of the museum in the greater art world, but also to help the museum effectively and efficiently serve its own community. And this included the community of budding artists right across the street. Next slide. In fact, Friends of Art Vice President Dorothy Clendening characterized a driving motivation for the Friends of Art this way. She said, quote, "Such a philanthropic effort could stimulate an interest in art in Kansas City, not only in lay groups, but hopefully in the students of the Art Institute, who, while they greatly admire the achievements of the old masters, must find their main interest and stimulus in what they are doing as developing artists by seeing what their contemporaries are doing," end quote. After a few initial faltering steps, the Friends of Art gained momentum near the close of 1935, but that didn't necessarily mean that the road was smooth. A membership rattling bump took place on November 24th. Just before Thanksgiving, 50 members of the Friends of Art convened in Atkins Auditorium. The purpose of that meeting was to vote on the purchase of a painting from a selection of 8 that had been chosen by the Committee of Submissions and that had been on view for the public for the last 2 weeks. Next slide. Fred Vincent, Friends of Art president, whom you see here under the star, read the bylaws to conditions for a Friends of Art purchase. He reminded members that a majority vote of those present was required for an acquisition to move forward. And I have to wonder too, whether he might have reiterated the words of Director Paul Gardner, expressing the criteria that should be considered. Gardner had previously stated that a Friends of Art purchase, quote, must not only appeal to the general public, but must have that quality which will bring the whole organization as much publicity as possible, end quote. Next slide, please. According to the minutes recorded by Mrs. Frank Ridge, after the ballots that members had been given when they entered the auditorium were filled out, collected, and tallied, there was a tie between two top paintings. High School Girl by Maurice Stern, which you see at the left. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to locate a color image of this painting, but found it in a 1930 periodical. And The Sun Treader by Thomas Hart Benton on the right. Next slide, please. Latvia-born Maurice Stern's High School Girl had earned an honorable mention at the Carnegie International Exhibition in 1930, and the artist had just enjoyed his first retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 1933. Next slide, please. Native Missourian Thomas Hart Benton had recently returned from New York to Kansas City to head the paintings department at the Kansas City Art Institute, right across the street from the museum, and to take on a mural commission for the state capitol in Jefferson City. He painted this portrait of Carl Ruggles, the avant-garde composer known for his bold, polyphonic, atonal orchestral work around 1934. Next slide, please. For this painting, Benton sketched and painted his longtime friend in his home in Arlington, Vermont, as the composer was banging out chords on his piano, dressed in shirt sleeves, corduroys, and as you can see in the painting, heavy work boots, as if some down-home Beethoven. The title of the portrait comes from Ruggles' best-known orchestral composition, which he named after a line in the poet Robert Browning's 1833 elegy to Percy Shelley. Sun Treader, light and life be thine forever. Next slide, please. So following that announcement of the Stern-Benton tie, there was a call for a second written vote to choose between these two paintings. That count revealed 13 Friends of Art votes for Stern's High School Girl, 21 in favor of Benton's Sun Treader, and 15 members who just said, nope, I'm not going to cast my ballot for either option. So if my math is correct, either one ballot slipped under those velvet seats in Atkins Auditorium, or perhaps a member abstained, because 13 plus 12 plus 15 only equals 49 votes, not 50. And I am trusting that Mrs. Frank Ridge did not make an error in her minute keeping. Things got complicated from that point forward. One member, Mr. Downing, moved that since a majority had not been achieved, the Friends of Art should simply go with the painting that received the third most votes, a work by Alexander Brooke. Another member, Robert Fizel, objected, insisting that since Stern and Benton needed to be totally rejected before a third painting could be fairly considered. With that, Mr. Downing withdrew his motion and threw his support behind the Benton. Then another vote was called at the urging of Eleanor Jones, with the rationale that, and here I'm paraphrasing Mrs. Ridge's minutes, that the Friends of Art just really needed to get with the program, get their act together, make a decision, because it would certainly be hard to get 8 more pictures all the way to Kansas City in a serious hassle. So Eleanor Jones's rationale caused a vote for Benton to jump. Then Stern gained another vote. And Mr. Downing, that champion of Brooke, moved again to just be done with Benton and Stern and get Brooke's picture. His motion was seconded. There was a rising vote in favor of that Brooke that unfortunately I could not locate. It's lost to the ages somewhere, but maybe every time I talk about a picture that we can't find, I'm just hoping that someone hears that and finds it for us. So there's a vote for the Brooke, and then suddenly a dark horse comes into the race in the form of Henry Varnum Poor portrait titled Ruth, and that received a motion to purchase and a second. But another vote was taken and a majority still was not reached. Next slide, please. With that, it was moved, and here I'll quote directly from Mrs. Ridge's careful minutes, that quote, Since no majority of the membership voted for any of the pictures, the committee be empowered to take the matter under consideration and then purchase for the Friends of Art a picture they agreed upon, end quote. And as you can see, the minutes continue explaining that the committee should be free to choose either the Stern or the Benton or another picture altogether, but that the decision should be made and the painting should be purchased by winter's end. So after the member who had been holding out for the Brook reiterated that the membership, quote, had distinctly expressed a desire not to buy any of the pictures exhibited, end quote, the motion that the committee be left to make the decision themselves was seconded and approved by a majority vote. So with a no decision, the Friends of Art adjourned and the meeting was over. So after the winter holidays, the Friends of Art returned to Atkins Auditorium to convene for their annual meeting on January 12th, 1936. Next slide, please. Director Paul Gardner announced that the committee had indeed come to a decision and unanimously voted to purchase Benton's Sun Treader. 2 days later, the Kansas City Times reported under the headline, "The Friends of Art decide," that the Friends of Art, quote, performed 2 valuable services for the community. They have set a high standard for future gifts to the gallery of the work of contemporary artists. And they have recognized not only that the best examples of so-called Middle Western School of Painting should be on view in Kansas City as the natural center of the region, but that artists of the Middle West should have tangible evidence of public interest in their work, end quote. So the first official Friends of Art purchase for the Nelson-Atkins, which you can see in the Origins exhibition, was without a doubt a memorable one, not only from its protracted process of acquisition, but also because of the painting itself. In fact, years later, on December 29th, 1939, when the Kansas City Star reported on the purchase that closed out the decade, the story made reference to what it called the tumultuous November 24th, 1935 meeting. The article noted, quote, that the Friends had had a little difficulty making their decision. In fact, that meeting of the members for the purchase recalled that historic occasion when the Friends finally decided upon Thomas Hart Benton's Sun Treader, end quote. The article continued, recalling the story that the official minutes tell in our archives, but then it adds some juicy details to the narrative. Quote, although in principle, the society had been dedicated to the acquisition of any representative work of modern art for which the gallery's own trust funds were not available, it soon turned out that several friends entertained strong personal opinions on the subject. And if Benton's portrait of Carl Ruggles at a distorted piano was modern art, well, they wanted none of it. And the article keeps going. The painting was eventually bought. There was, however, a bitter aftermath of dissent, and at least one member resigned in protest and could never again be persuaded to contribute his $10 to such a nefarious enterprise. Next slide, please. And this is still quoting from that article. As for the society, it was so shaken by the experience that the next year it went conventional in a big way and presented the gallery with an inoffensive but distinctly weak and uninteresting landscape by Nicholas Tchaikovsky. Next slide. So it seems as though Benton's Sun Treader did indeed fulfill Director Paul Gardner's insistence that the first official purchase of the Friends of Art, quote, must have that quality which will bring the whole organization as much publicity as possible, end quote, as attested not only by the legendary status of the acquisition, as well as the beefy thick curatorial files that are just outside my office that include just numerous published references to this picture. In fact, the painting that marked both the Friends of Art first purchase, as well as the first painting by Benton to enter the collection, that again you can see in the Origins exhibition, is out in the world in another way. Next slide, please. It graces the album cover of the complete works of Carl Ruggles that includes the Sun Treader. And in hindsight, it might have actually been the perfect soundtrack for that tumultuous November 1935 Friends of Art meeting. So let's take a quick listen and see if you agree. So Tara, could you please play us out and into the Q&A with a few seconds of the Buffalo Philharmonic performing Carl Ruggles' Sun Treader? Thanks. That should be on the next slide, I think, Tara. Well, I'm not going to hum it, I'll tell you. This is atonal, polyphonic, full orchestral composition, 16 minutes long. I would urge you, if you have the time, just to do it. There it is. This is why I'm not humming it when you see the score. It is full of dissonance and clashes and crescendos. So that's why I thought, boy, if this could have been playing in the background when those ballots were cast, what a great soundtrack.
Thanks, Stephanie, for that. And everybody for those wonderful presentations. Sorry for the slight technical difficulties there at the end with the audio, but I hope you got a little bit of a taste of the drama of that piece. So since we started a little late, we will run a little late if that is okay with everybody. So if you have any questions, go ahead and just pop them into the Q&A and we will be happy to answer those. Okay. So our first question, they say, this was wonderful, thank you. Having heard all of these stories, how do you hope to keep these stories together with the artworks moving forward after this exhibition? And were there any discoveries that surprised any of you?
I think I want to jump in and answer that. It's a great question. And there's several things. One is just the archival, in that we preserve our labels that the curators write for the exhibition, and we make sure those labels live. We enter them into our database so that we have them, but also we're always trying to utilize new technologies. And some of you may have used the Smartify app, which is the app that you can download on your phone and use for additional content. When you're in the galleries, if you haven't done it, we really encourage you to do that. And these are the kind of stories that we want to live on Smartify, so that moving forward, even after the run of the exhibition, you'll have different voices, different stories, different ways into the works of art in the Origins show and throughout the collection. And I think that we all had surprises during this. And I think that one of the big surprises that we all had was the very first acquisition in the museum, the brick. But I think we're all surprised actually that it looks better than we thought it looked, because the image we were all living with for a long time was one side of it that was plain. So the actual impression, thanks to MacKenzie's work on the exhibition, it's a little bit more visually attractive than we thought it was.
Anybody else? So the next question is, do the Friends of Art still purchase art for the museum?
So, after that first meeting and that purchase of the Sun Treader, the Friends of Art went on for the next about 2.5 decades into the 1950s, purchasing only work of contemporary American art, making at least one acquisition a year outside those restrictions of William Rockwell Nelson's will. But then the organization, kind of as it stood then as a subscription, kind of a dues paying membership to purchase art, kind of pivoted and changed. And the money that Friends of Art supported the museum as members with, became used to fill and fulfill other parts of the museum's mission. So long answer to not currently.
Right. The next question is one that we've gotten a lot from staff who have seen the show. Will any of the objects in the Origins show be put on display in their appropriate galleries? If so, what and when? Curators?
Well, a few of the objects that are in Origins were removed from the permanent galleries already. So the beautiful Bingham painting, Fishing on the Mississippi, usually lives in the permanent galleries. And I would defer to Stephanie on timing for when that would return. But we also have a Spanish processional cross that usually lives in the European galleries. And I think that that's slated to go back eventually. But you know, we're always changing things in the galleries here at the museum. And so you never know what you're going to see the next time that you come. So with many, many thousands of works in the collection, it's fun to be able to have the opportunity to bring some things that we don't see as often into the Origins exhibition and give you a chance to see some lesser known works in the collection.
And I'd just love to add, I think we would love to see almost everything in this show make its rotation into the galleries, but I'd love to hear from all of you and, you know, and your friends through the run of the show. You know, however you want to share comments, I'd love to hear what you think. What are your favorite works? What would you like to see come into the galleries? I already have expectations that one or two of them will make their way into our permanent galleries not long after the exhibition is over.
We'll all look forward to that. Next question. If you could research the origin of any other artwork in the museum, what would it be?
Well, we have the fun of doing this every day here at the Nelson-Atkins. We research the ownership history or the provenance of all of the objects in the collection. It's a very long process, but we have the fun of finding out new stories about objects continuously through the research that we do every day here at the museum. And we like to put the results of that research on our website when it's complete. So we have an object search on the website that you can go to and pull up a particular object and find out if our provenance research is available on that search. And we're adding to that all the time. So hopefully that you'll have the opportunity to go on there and find some of the unique stories of some of your favorite objects in the collection.
Great. We have time for about 2 more questions that we've got lined up here. So the next one is, I'm sure there were so many great stories. How did you narrow down which pieces to feature in this exhibition? And are there any you researched that you wish had made it into the exhibit?
I think this is a MacKenzie and Kim question because they got very tired of hearing me say no.
You know, it was a challenge. You know, we wanted to be able to put together an exhibition of works from our permanent collection without emptying all of our other galleries. So we tried to find mostly things that weren't currently on view, but that would tell the stories that we knew we really wanted to tell. And so it was a challenge. We did go back and forth a lot. There was a lot of discussion. But I think that what we came up with hopefully really tells the stories in the best way possible. And if you go and visit Origins, you'll see that a number of objects in the collection are connected to archival documents that come straight from our archives, such as the brick that I showed you in my presentation and the decree that acknowledged the relationship between the Nelson-Atkins and the Louvre. So that guided our selections as well in a certain respect, because we wanted to be able to display objects that had archival documents connected to them too.
And our last, I'm sorry, go ahead, William.
I was just going to say that I think one of the things that was exciting for all of us about this project that Tara, MacKenzie, and Kim put together is that if you notice, it sort of ends right before the Second World War. And there are decades and decades of stories left to tell. And I think that, you know, we'd all be interested in over time, particularly as we get closer to our centennial in 2033, to continue to move forward and tell more stories over the years. So, you know, there's a lot of work left to do. We have nearly 40,000 objects, and that's 40,000 at least 40,000 stories, right? Go ahead, Tara.
Right. And our last question, since we're a little over, this will be our last one. And this one might be for you too, Mackenzie, but I'll let you negotiate that. Were there any pieces of art in the collection that have a difficult to trace provenance or history? Besides every single one of them.
Well, conducting provenance research is different. It's a new experience of every single object we research because every object has their own story to tell and their own life that they have lived before they come into the museum collection. So there are unique challenges inherent in researching every object in the collection.
All right. Well, I think that will do it for tonight. Thank you all so much for attending. We're so glad that we had so many folks interested in hearing more of our origin story. And we really hope that you will take the chance to come visit the exhibition. It's just visually stunning and so interesting, all of the stories and the documents that are included in the exhibition. So we hope to see you all in the galleries and have a good evening.